Tonight I'm going to talk to you about truth and about fairy tales, about justice and about injustice. In the months to follow, you're going to learn that many of the things which some of the major news agencies have been telling you are untrue.
Where did the shots come from? Where did you hear the shots come from?
From a fence between the book depository and the railroad track.
Cut.
Information concerning the cause of the death of your president has been withheld from you.
Now, Mr. Nix, where did you hear the shots come from?
It came from a fence.
Cut.
You will learn that there has been and continues to be a concerted effort to keep you from learning these facts.
They finally pulled him aside, this man did, and pulled him aside and said, now, Mr. Nix, what did the Warren Commission say? Where did they say these shots came from?
From the book depository.
And they said, that's right, and that's what we want you to say.
And it is all the more dangerous when a fairy tale becomes accepted as reality because powerful elements of the press tell you that the fairy tale is true.
And I remember riding home with him. He was so upset. I mean, he would hit the driving wheel, the steering wheel, and say, why? I mean, they try and make me look like I'm insane. And I know that's where they came from. I know that's where the shots came from.
The people of this country don't have to be protected from the truth. This country was not built on the idea that a handful of nobles, whether located in our federal agencies in Washington, D.C., or in the news agencies in New York, should decide what was good for the people to know and what they should not know. This is a totalitarian concept which presumes that the leaders of our federal government and the men in control of the powerful press media constitute a special elite which, by virtue of their nobility and their brilliance, empower them to think for the people. Personally, I would rather put my confidence in the common sense of the people of this country. The truth about the assassination of the president has been concealed from you long enough. Those forces which are fighting so hard today to tell you that they have examined the Warren report and that everything is fine and that our investigation has uncovered nothing are not merely going to lose this fight, they have already lost it.
Welcome to the next installment of the new JFK show with Gary King. This week, Gary interviews Larry Rivera, who has some remarkable revelations, especially related to Beverly Brunson, who is an early researcher who is in contact and collaboration with Harold Weisberg. I think you're going to like this.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. A person that has never been given a proper recognition in JFK research has been Beverly Brunson from Baxter Springs, Kansas, who was an author and a poet. She was born in November the 7th, 1928. She passed along in February of 2000. Her father was mayor of the city, of the town of Baxter Springs. He had been mayor for 10 years there, and the Brunson family is very popular in Baxter Springs. Some of my research, I had been in touch with Baxter Springs Historical Society. They never knew about Beverly's studies and her research on JFK. From what I gather and from what I've been able to find out, she was kept to herself most of her life. She lived more or less a secluded life, with her parents and her longtime companion, Mary Gibson. According to her second cousin, Glenna Shanks, most of her records and writings perished in an accident while they were being transported during a storm. Fortunately, that happened to be the case. We know of her documents from the Hood College, where Harold Weisberg kept introduced most of his research and his papers for students of the case to retrieve. It's very interesting that Weisberg never actually used any of her writings, any of her research, because maybe at the time he considered her ideas and her theories to be quite radical, in the sense where Beverly believed that a lot of the photographic record in the JFK assassination investigation had been altered. We all know that Weisberg did not actually believe that there was alteration, as, for example, the Alton 6 and the Zapruder film. Maybe for that reason, he did not promote Beverly's work. What he did, however, was he filed it away. Thanks to Weisberg's foresight in doing that, now 45 years later, we are able to revisit Ms. Brunson's work and appreciate the significance of her insights and her perceptiveness.
Let's talk a little bit about Harold Weisberg. For some people in the audience that may not be as familiar, because he's not spoken about as much as he should. So you just give us a little brief background on Harold Weisberg.
Well, he's considered the dean of JFK research. Thanks to Harold, we have so many documents available now. He spent thousands, tens of thousands of dollars in freedom of information act lawsuits against the government, and trying to pry all these records and files from the government that had been stashed away. He wrote the first book that really hit at the conspiracy and the whitewash of the Warren Commission. In fact, his first book was called Whitewash. And from there, he also published Whitewash 2 and Photographic Whitewash and so many other studies, some of them that were never published, actually.
Right. What I'd like to interject here is that how lucky we are, because for us just to pull something up on the internet took Mr. Weisberg years of fighting in court and tens of thousands of dollars to have this little document that you can just pull up in 2 seconds.
That's right. Quite an incredible site where you can go and pull all these documents, and he's got them all filed away and organized in alphabetical order, and you just have to go over there and do your homework. You want to. And
wasn't he a prominent person?
Find out about the assassination.
Yeah, wasn't he a prominent person in the government who had access to these records because of his position?
Yes, he had been an investigator for the government, but that had nothing to do with his activism later on. With the JFK investigation. He just did that, out of his own initiative, actually, and so his work over the years spanned decades. He never stopped investigating the assassination. He never stopped writing, and he actually got sick because he would be sitting for 18 hours a day, and that's not good for your legs when you do that. And a lot of his health problems, circulatory problems, because of that. In the mid-'60s, he toured the nation promoting his book and doing lectures and going all over the nation talking about the assassination. And later on, in 1968, 69, he was involved in the Garrison investigation, and he went before the grand jury talking about testifying on some of the information that he had dug up. And over the years, he was at the forefront. And we owe a lot to Harold on everything that he did as far as JFK. And everybody that writes anything about JFK has to source and cite, his work in one way or another.
And he has stood the test of time, no doubt.
That's right.
All right, so let's go on to Miss Beverly Brunson, who was sending him letters, and obviously he had the foresight to put them away for future work.
Yeah.
He was just waiting on Larry Rivera, that's all it was.
Well, I think it's very important that she takes her place among the greats of JFK research. And, in 1966, she first started contacting Harold, and they maintained a casual relationship only for a couple of years, where she sent many unsolicited letters and manuscripts detailing her theories while she pored over the 26 volumes of the Warren Commission. And she was extremely well-versed and informed, and she sourced her work with precision for others to follow in her research. Now, like I said, with everything that Harold had on his plate, he admitted that he could not properly address and analyze her work, and opting instead to place her investigations in a university archive, which is what happened. Like I said, perhaps the reason Weisberg did not take much of her research seriously might have been that he did not believe in photographic alteration. Beverly was emphatic that most of the photographic record was tainted. So time and technology has confirmed that Ms. Brunson was right in many of her theories, and that's why we need to talk about it.
All right, now it's going to be difficult to explain a picture, so you're going to have to be really clear in explaining, what we're trying to see here, because it is difficult to imagine these things. But once you see it, it's really kind of clear. So go ahead and let's talk about, her findings way back in the 60s.
We would need hours to talk about everything that Beverly did. I did an investigation on the motorcycle cops, motor jockeys, as they were called. Beverly was, I believe, the only one at the time who really went and investigated what happened and what each and every one of those four individuals did during the assassination. She read everything that was available And in 1967 and 1968, after months of investigation and careful evaluation of all the testimony, FBI interviews and all that, she determined that one of the motorcycle jockeys, who was part of the immediate escort, ran his bike up the grassy knoll, chasing what was presumably one of the shooters. Okay, now, even the Warren Commission report, which was the condensed version of the Warren Commission that you would find on paperback and in libraries and everything, it went as far as trying to dispel that ugly speculation about the Knoll Rider. And I'm quoting here what the Warren Commission report said at the time, that there are no witnesses who have ever stated this, and there is no evidence to support this claim. Now, you know, that was a total lie, because Beverly found interviews of at least 4 different witnesses who talked about that. And then she found more information on actual testimony of 2 other individuals who I'm just going to talk about briefly here, who talked about the Knoll Rider.
And a policeman throwed his motorcycle down in the middle of the street and run up the embankment with his pistol drawn. He was running toward that particular spot. And also another motorcycle policeman right behind him tried to ride up the embankment on his motorcycle, and it turned over about halfway up the embankment. And he got out, he got off his motorcycle and left it laying there and run on over to the fence with his gun in his hand. The smoke came from behind the hedge on the north side of the plaza, and a motorcycle policeman dropped his motorcycle in the street with his gun in his hand and run up the embankment to the hedge.
All right, there you go, in their own words, Larry, saying that it happened.
In a letter in 1967, she lamented to Weisberg, and I quote, "In fact, so far as I know, nobody has ever been interested in him," talking about the Knoll Rider. And she wrote various papers, for example, one titled "The President's Motorcycle Escort Activities Immediately After Shots Were Fired." She quoted these 4 witnesses, and I'll name them: George Davis, James Simmons, Luke Winborn, and Clement Johnson. And none of these witnesses testified before the Warren Commission. Briefly, each and every one of them talked about the motorcycle policeman drove up the grassy knoll. Mr. Davis stated his attention was directed to the motorcycle escort. Mr. Winborn talked about the police officer riding up on the grassy slope of the north side of Elm Street. And this officer rushed up the steps leading up the pavilion and was lost from sight. Johnson stated that his attention was attracted to the motorcycle escort. Beverly, obviously she read these passages and she investigated more about this. She determined that the rider on the slope was a member of the escort immediately at the rear of the limousine, and it could not have been Martin, Hartis, or Shaney from her investigation. Therefore, she concluded that this had to be Douglas Jackson. And Mr. Jackson was never called before the commission. Now, obviously, we would never know what his actions were or why he rode up the slope there. Strange, because this is not. She talked about this. She wrote about this. That this ride is not pictured in any of the films taken from the south side of the street, and that would be the Nix film, the Orville Nix film. That it involved one of the escort at the right rear of the president's limousine is clear from the testimony of these 2 witnesses who saw it from widely different angles. Here's where she introduced S.M. Holland, who was on the overpass, and Lee Bowers, the famous Lee Bowers, who was on the North Terminal Tower, Railroad Tower there. S.M. Holland, saw Hartis drop off his cycle on the south side of the street, and an officer of the same escort ride up the knoll. Unquote, end quote there. And if you go in specifically into the Warren Commission, volume 6, page 247, S.M. Holland talks about it. I'll quote it here real quick. And another one tried to ride up the hill on his motorcycle and got about halfway up there, and he run up the rest of the way on foot. And then he ends his, this part of his testimony saying, and the motorcycle policeman jumped over the curb with his motorcycle, and he tried to ride up the hill on his motorcycle, and he tipped over with him up there. And he ran up there the rest of the way with his, and at that moment he was going to say with his gun drawn, but Samuel Stern cut him off and didn't allow him to finish his testimony. And it's very interesting because later on, Mark Lane interviewed S.M. Holland about that for his documentary film, Rush to Judgment. not only was Mr. Holland still adamant about what he witnessed regarding the two motorcycle officers and their actions that day, the two he's talking about, Jackson and Hodges, but Lane allowed him to finish what he was about to say in his Warren Commission testimony when Stern rudely cut him off. This is what Holland had to say. And a policeman throwed his motorcycle down in the middle of the street and ran up the embankment with his pistol drawn. He was running toward that particular spot, and also another motorcycle policeman right behind him tried to ride up the embankment on his motorcycle, and it turned over about halfway up there. This would have been Jackson up the embankment, and he got off his motorcycle, and he left it there. He left it laying there and run up over to the fence with his gun drawn in his hand. It was pretty specific there on what S.M. Holland saw regarding the Knoll Rider. You know, I think that's pretty. There's a lot of documentation there that supports the issue here of the Knoll Rider and what S.M. Holland saw. Now then, the Bowers confirmed what Holland saw, but from the other side, from a different angle atop the railroad tower behind the picket fence in the pergola structure. Now Bowers confirmed a very important detail, that the motor jockey was only there momentarily, and he abandoned his motorcycle for a moment and then got on it and proceeded. Okay, and this is Lee Bowers in his Warren Commission testimony, talking about how the motorcycle cop immediately followed there. You know, immediately following there was a motorcycle policeman who shot nearly all the way to the top of the incline. And further down, he was part of the motorcade and had left it for some reason. He came almost to the top, and I believe abandoned his motorcycle for a moment and then got on it and proceeded. I don't know. And he just shot up over the curb and up. And he left the motorcycle and he came up the incline on the motorcycle. I mean, that's
pretty straight up.
Obvious. That's pretty obvious there. And then even Abraham Zapruder testified about motorcycle cops running right behind me. He testified, yes, some of them were motorcycle cops. I guess they left their motorcycles running, and they were running right behind me, of course, in the line of the shooting. You know, this is all, you know, pretty cut and dry as far as I'm concerned. Ms. Brunson was right there with it, you know, at that time. She thought this Knoll Rider, she was pretty sure it was Jackson. You know, some people thought that it might have been Clyde Hager, but Clyde Hager is seen parking his motorcycle and running right parallel with the picket fence all the way to the corner there where the picket fence joins the overpass, the triple overpass over there in that corner. So it couldn't have been Clyde Hager. Finally, she ended her thoughts in this manner. Thus, of the four men at the immediate rear of the car who were in a position to have observed events in the aftermath of the shooting and who could have taken action, the only one who appears to have taken direct and purposeful action is the one completely missing from the commission's evidence. And she was appalled that this man, who, you know, she actually thought this man was a hero because he was the only one who actually took any purposeful action, you know, in going up there and confronting any of the shooters. So in her mind, this guy was actually a hero. And then she was totally perplexed as to why they would keep Jackson so much in the dark. And, you know, like she said, Jackson was a great unsung hero of that day. But Miss Brunson was very much convinced that Knoll Rider actually existed, that they tried to suppress it, that the identity of the Knoll Rider was Douglas Jackson, something that you don't read about in any of the JFK books. You know, nobody ever talks about it. And I think it's time that we start giving Miss Brunson a lot of credit, you know, for writing about something that has apparently been suppressed so many years. Our next topic here on the comparison of the Alchin 6 with the Zapruder frame 255, which she discovered in a very primitive way, actually, where you don't really think that something like this has been staring at us in the face, you know, for so many years. All she wanted to do was compare the Alchin 6 with frame 255, which is the actual frame which corresponds to the Alchin 6. At the time of that Ike Alchin snapped his photograph, from the other side of Elm Street was Zapruder. And you can see most of the actions of the people in the limo, and they all correspond pretty much to what they're doing in the Alchin 6. But there's a fellow there. We're talking about James Shaney, motorcycle policeman. If you look at the Alchin 6, he's the first motorcycle cop on the left. and that would be to the right of the limo as you see it coming down Elm Street. James Chaney is abreast of JFK. Is probably within 3 feet.
He could reach out and touch him with his arm.
Absolutely. But when you look at the Zapruder film, and specifically frame 255, or any of the frames after the limo emerges from behind the Stemmons Freeway sign, Chaney's not in there at all.
Let me see if I can describe this for the... Just give me 1 second, see if I can describe this for the people. All right, not everyone is completely aware of the Alton 6 and 7. All right, the Alton 6 is the famous photo where you can see Jackie's glove touching the president. He's clutching his throat. You can see Lee in the doorway, though we're not discussing that at this point. And if you look right to your left, there is Officer Chaney. He is literally within the arms. He could reach out and touch the shoulder of the president. Now, as the president is coming from behind the Stemmons Freeway sign, the motorcycle officer is not there. Now, there's also a reflection that had to be dealt with because his reflection was there. And so let's go from there. So hopefully I've kind of, let everyone see exactly what we're trying to see here, because I know it's difficult over the radio.
Yes, that's right. Here's what Beverly had to say about that, and I'll quote her right here. And he can't be too far in the rear of Zapruder to have caught him in the picture, since he had to turn his head to look back at the president. He is next to the car and up on it, yet he does not appear in Zapruder 255 at all. And I think possibly this is a paint job. This would explain all the blue paint, and it would explain the sudden cessation of reflections on the body of the limousine after the waving man disappears. So before the limo enters the obstruction of the Stemmons Freeway, you can see these perfect reflections of Chaney on his motorcycle, and you examine Zapruder frames 193 to 207, you will see those reflections on the side of the limo. However, as soon as the limo emerges from behind the sign, there are no reflections whatsoever. What looks like blue paint has been inserted there. And obviously, we don't see Chaney at all. And when we look at C-255, which is the counterpart of the Alton 6 from the other side of the street, you should be able to see James Chaney, yet you do not.
Absolutely. So, and this vehicle is freshly waxed. It is like a mirror. You can completely see everything. If you look really close, which is something I've never done, is look at the reflections on the limousine. And it's literally, you know how they keep that limousine.
That's right.
Perfectly shiny. And it's a mirror showing you some things that they really didn't want you to see. So much so they had to take blue ink and paint it out.
And as far as I'm concerned, nobody has ever, talked about any of this, which gives us, even further proof that the Zapruder film has been altered. And these are the most simple ways to prove alteration without really having to go into the more complicated schemes that Douglas Horne has written about, which you're going to have on the show pretty soon.
Yes, we're going to have Doug Horne up. I think next week or the next we'll have Judy Baker coming up real soon. Ed Haslam, I do want to, since we just brought it up, Ed Haslam was in town tonight, and there was 1,000 cars. The cars were spilling over into the street, and they were turning people away at the door over his book with Judy Baker and his book about
Dr. Mary's Monkey.
Yeah, Dr. Mary's Monkey. It's just overflowing. So that shows you that we're making big-time progress, and the things that Larry's doing here, Mr. Haslam's doing, we are breaking through regardless of the controlled opposition who's saying that the Zapruder film was not altered. That is a complete lie. And this lady, Miss Brunson, had it nailed back in the 60s, just like a lot of people, like Penn Jones. He was asked point blank, do you think we'll ever know what happened? He says, we solved the case in the 60s. It's just you're never going to hear it on TV. It's not ready for prime time.
Good.
It's all right here. So we're going to Larry and I have decided to start shining a light on, and actually some of these female researchers who have done such a fantastic job, and Mae Brussels is in line for sure.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Sylvia Marsh, Shirley Martin, Lily Castellano, Maggie Field, Gail Jackson Nix, the new breed, the new generation of researchers, on and on. I looked at who probably might have corroborated Brunson's findings, and we find that in 2011, a Norwegian researcher by the name of Sverre Angstad independently corroborated what Brunson found, back in 1968. There's a website where he actually inserts a little figure of a motorcycle cop over there, right next to JFK and Zapruder 255, and he did quite a nice job of doing it. I found it on the internet. I thought that he deserved a little bit of recognition on that. Like I said, corroborating Brunson. After realizing that they were trying to hide James Chaney from the Zapruder, then we started to ask ourselves, why? Well, guess what? Beverly had the answer to that as well. Okay, so this goes a lot deeper as far as the cover-up, especially with the Warren Commission and all. Back in 1964, the Warren Commission did a reenactment of the Zapruder film and the entire assassination sequence. In this reenactment, they went and they brought substitute limos to reenact. Actually, they did two. One was a white car that did not look at all. It was not as big as the SX-100, the SS-100X limousine Lincoln Continental that JFK rode in. What Beverly observed was that in this reenactment, they had a little motorcycle while the reenactment was on Houston Street. And if you go and you check out Commission Exhibit 875, you'll see that they have this little motorcycle. Now, the spacing of the motorcycle is a little bit further away from the stand-in limo that they used. And then you can see pictures of the 6th floor, southeast window, the 6th floor of the TSBD, where they're tracking the limo with the little motorcycle there. And they keep tracking it, but only as far as the bend where it turns into Elm Street, where the motorcade went from Houston and turned left onto Elm Street. And for some reason, unexplained reason at the time, you don't see that. You only see the motorcycle up until there, and then after that, you don't see the motorcycle at all, once it's going down Elm Street. And Beverly wanted to know why. At the time, maybe a lot of people haven't really realized it. Maybe they haven't studied the perspective and the lay of Elm Street and how it downslopes away from the TSBD. Beverly realized that the reason that this motorcycle was absent from the reenactment once the car was on Elm Street was because the motorcycle cop would have been in the line of fire of any shooter from the 6th floor of the depository. Now that was, to me, that was an
mind-blowing,
incredibly important. Yeah, that was an incredibly important find by Brunson there.
Yes.
And nobody has ever really paid much attention to that.
And if you go to Dealey Plaza, it is such a slope that it's a
that's right.
And it's totally plausible what you just said. Just gives me goosebumps.
That's right.
Wow.
That's right. So then, and if you look at the images from the reenactment, they're so deceptive because A, they don't include the motorcycle, and B, some of the angles that they introduce these cars make it so that the crosshairs stay away from that motorcycle, the position of the motorcycle cop as much as possible. There's a commission exhibit, for example, 898, that shows the limousine actually on a different path, so as to keep the crosshairs, more on the JFK figure and keep them away from the position of where the motorcycle would have been had they really reenacted this, in the proper manner. So then, trying to find out why this would have been, I went and we looked at some other studies. For example, this fellow, Dale Weatherly, did a study published in The Investigator in 1994-1995, and he was looking at the downslope there of Elm Street. It happened to be quite pronounced there. And I've been there many times. I've taken pictures. In fact, in a study that's soon to be published at Veterans Today, we're going to introduce this information. And the downslope is quite considerable there. So any motorcycle cop riding on the right rear fender of the limousine, and another issue here is the lateral angle from the 6th floor. It's not just the downslope, but the lateral angle, which is 9 degrees 21 minutes away from the 6th floor to the left. So both of these angles would have really placed that motorcycle cop, had he been there in the reenactment, would have been right there in the middle of the crosshairs. And this confirms Brunson's investigation. So both the downslope and the lateral angle suggest that any motorcycle riding to the right rear of the limousine would have essentially blocked the view of any shooter from the southeast window of the 6th floor of that building. So then we did a little bit more investigating on this. Back in 1964, OIC senior member Vincent Salandria went and he took a very important picture. And what Vince did, Mr. Salandria, he went in and he reenacted the Alton 6. And in my estimation, I think that's one of the most important photographs ever taken by any JFK researcher, because it showed the position of Alton, but without any of the cars, or without any of the limos, without any of the crowd. And it gave you that really nice perspective on the position of the doorway, how the Elm Street slopes down towards you, and you can appreciate the incredible slope there on Elm Street. And it explains many of the things that we see in the Alton 6, many of the phenomena. Alton's is his photographic equipment, the telephoto lens, and it explains a lot of the phenomena that we see in the Alton 6 photograph. So Vince went and he did this reenactment. And it's an excellent picture, and many people should see this picture in order to really appreciate what's going on in the Alton 6. That's another very important piece of information that we have on the downslope of Elm Street that really confirms this. So then, when we looked at the Mormon picture, and if you look at the Mormon picture, this is all following Beverly's excellent research here. You'll see that the Mormon picture, the limo and the motorcycle cops, are completely horizontal. And if you look at the retaining wall at the top that joins where Zapruder was standing, it's completely horizontal as well. For some reason, and Beverly was very keen on this, she also suspected alteration of the Mormon photograph, and that's right now, we're not going to talk about that specifically right now. She studied the Mormon picture, and she found many anomalies in this, specifically about the motorcycle cops, because she suspected that they had been sort of messed around with there to also alter that position there that would have established that they would have been in the line of fire. When you look at this Mormon picture, you can't help but notice that the limo and the motorcycle cops are way too flat as far as, their position, and they're not on that downward slope that they would have been had the picture been taken, had the picture been properly presented. Mm-hmm. It seems like it might have been tilted in a way so that motorcycle cop on the right would have been at a lower angle and not be as high where he would have been so obviously in the line of fire from the shooter from the 6th floor southeast window, the 6th floor of the depository. So we went and we actually tilted. We went in and when we tilted it a little bit, even though we start tilting it, you can't tilt it enough to compensate for that certain angles there in the picture that need to be compensated for. And I had a picture that I took back in 1991. I compared it with the Mormon photograph, and I noticed that retaining wall at the top needs to be tilted to the left because it's way too flat in the Mormon picture as it is today. And when you tilt it the way that my photograph is, the one that I took in 1991, because I went and I stood there where Mormon had stood, and I took a picture that little did I know that I would be using it so many years later, for this study. It's very impressive, what they did, and this is all coming from Beverly's research.
Beverly Brunson.
We're only now starting to appreciate, what she did here for the JFK research.
All right, we're going to call it right there for a break. We'll be right back with Mr. Larry Rivera.
We can now say, with moral certainty and considerable scientific authority, that the death of JFK was committed by a meticulously executed conspiracy which was obscured by an extensive cover-up. Murder in Dealey Plaza, edited by James Fetzer, goes to the heart of the JFK assassination. You'll read new and up-to-date information regarding the Secret Service, the Lincoln limousine, the medical evidence, the cover-up, altering the film, framing the patsy, and the silent historians. Also, 16 smoking guns, each one crushing the government's lone assassin scenario. A world-class chronology of November 22nd, 1963. Chapters by David W. Mantic, Gary Aguilar, Vincent Palomera, Douglas Weldon, Jack White, Ira David Wood III, James H. Fetzer, Doug Horn, and a classic essay by Bertrand Russell. The complete story in the pages of one single book, edited by James H. Fetzer. Read it now. Read it again. You'll use it as a reference. Murder in Dealey Plaza. Available at Amazon.com and major bookstores around the world. It's murder.
Mr. Nix, where were you on November 22nd, 1963?
Standing on the corner of Main and Houston.
And did you take any pictures of the presidential limousine as it went through Dealey Plaza?
Yes, I've taken pictures before and after, before the assassination and during the assassination.
And you know, of course, that your pictures were eventually used by the government to determine where the limousine was when some of the shots were fired.
Yes.
Did you deliver a copy of your film to the federal government?
Yes, I delivered a copy of my film to the federal government about December the 1st.
About a little over a week after the assassination.
Yes, my film got lost in the processing plant.
Where is the original film?
The original film belonged to United Press International. The government has a duplicate copy.
And where is that duplicate copy?
In the archives.
And is that the duplicate copy which was used by the Warren Commission for the purpose of determining, along with other film, the Muchmore film and the Zapruder film, where the presidential limousine was when some of the shots were fired?
I would say so.
Well, you now have a copy of your film, which you were kind enough to show to us this afternoon. Is that copy the same as the original which you gave to the FBI on December 1st?
I would say no. There is some films maybe missing, some frames. Some of the frames were ruined.
Does the film which you have at the present time have the same number of frames as the film which you delivered to the FBI on December 1st?
I would say no, but it's cause of losing maybe a frame here and there.
At the time the shots were fired, did you look at the book depository building?
No.
Did you think at that time that the shots came from the book depository building?
No, I thought it came from a fence between the book depository and the railroad track. Most everyone thought it came from the fence behind the book depository.
Now, in this section of this presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about diversions. And the way Brunson described it in her research, she was talking about firecrackers and streamers that were thrown that day around the motorcade route, specifically at the turn of Elm, from Houston on the Elm, going down Elm Street to the grassy knoll area. More than 50 witnesses claimed that they heard and saw firecrackers explode during the assassination. It's been well documented. The documentation is extensive. And, even Secret Service men who were in the follow-up car reported firecrackers going off. Witnesses who lined the parade heard firecrackers around the intersection of Elm and Houston. And all this is included in the documentation. Also, the smell of gunpowder and the amount of smoke that permeated the area that day, despite higher than normal winds around noontime that day. Brunson wrote extensively about this, and she was convinced that the use of diversionary tactics, such as these firecrackers and streamers, was fundamental to the success of the operation. Now, Brunson also pointed out about the misconception that people had about smoking rifles and the impossibility of this, given the characteristics of modern rifles, which emit very little smoke, if any at all. If you look at the Dave Wigman film, there's a frame in that film that actually shows, some smoke drifting with a grassy knoll. And she never saw this footage, but that's just an example that we can present here of smoke drifting around Dealey Plaza that day.
More than one person who's not even researchers have always said guns don't really have a big puff of smoke anymore. And
right.
People have pointed out to me, and I've really often thought about that. And so it's possible that the railroad men running around to the fence were actually running to a diversionary tactic. It's possible. Smoke
was reported by many, many people, even S.M. Holland, Simmons.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they were standing over there on the overpass. So now Brunson located, in my opinion, something that has never ever been talked about much. In fact, probably has never been talked about, and it's the remnants of a streamer which she located on the hood of LBJ's car. If you look at the Auction 6 photograph, you'll see right below the windshield wiper on the driver's side of the car, right there on the hood, what looks like an object, foreign object, and it's not part of the windshield wiper at all. What we did is we went and looked at pictures of the same car earlier in the motorcade, and we saw what Brunson was talking about. This could have been the remains of a streamer or floating device that was thrown in the motorcade route as a diversionary tactic. Who knows? Maybe that's what LBJ was ducking for, because we know that LBJ was ducking at the time of the Auction 6 was taken.
Let's kind of be clear about a streamer. We're talking about almost like a firecracker type streamer that would fly through the air and cause your attention to be diverted.
So, and how do we know that this is entirely possible? Well, Congressman Yarborough, in his testimony, talked about how he smelled gunpowder all the way to the hospital. What Brunson was talking about is that the only thing that could explain this would have been, that object, that was on the hood of LBJ's car. That was something to think about. And not only that, Secret Service Agent Warren Taylor talked about it. I'm going to quote here. I noticed what now seems to me might have been a short piece of streamer flying in the air close to the ground. But due to the confusion of the moment, I thought that it was a firecracker going off.
Secret Service.
You can't get, Secret Service Agent Warren Taylor, and you can see that, you can read about that in Volume 18, page 782. Those were the Secret Service agent reports that were published in the Warren Commission.
That's powerful.
Now, when we're talking about streamer, it's very interesting if you look at the Alton's photograph a little bit closer. To the right, at the curb, you can see this gentleman. He's not looking at the motorcade at all, but he's looking sort of in a space above the LBJ's car, maybe towards the second or third floor of the TSBD. And his mouth is open, and he seems to be pointing at this lady that's right in front of him about something that he sees up there suspended in the air. Brunson pointed this out, and this is why, we need to talk about this a little bit, because this gentleman, his reaction, if you look closely at the Auction 6 photograph, his reaction is really in awe and of total surprise of something that is, floating up there that has just exploded in midair. Like I said, he seems to be pointing this out to this woman who's in a dark business suit right in front of him. She happens to be in the process of turning around, left to see, what he's, I just said that's what he's so freaked out about. Is it possible that somebody threw one of those streamers from one of the windows of the TSBD, maybe the second or third floor? That's totally possible. This would have been from the third or second floor, would have been a perfect place to throw some kind of object from, because it would have been under cover. This would have been perfect as a diversionary tactic. I'm going to speculate a little bit. There's an individual that sort of fell through the cracks, a person by the name of John Hawkins. He worked on the third floor for a company named Allen and Bacon, they were a textbook company that worked out of the TSBD right there on the third floor. This gentleman, whose wife, her name was Peggy Joyce Hawkins, went downtown to watch the parade, and she brought her little son, John Jr. John Jr. happens to be the figure, the famous woman and child figure that you can see in the Altons that seems to be right there next to the doorway, but in actuality she's down at the curb. John Hawkins was never interviewed by anybody after the assassination, and the only reason that we know that he was present that day is because Peggy stated in her FBI interview dated March 26, 1964, and she mentioned that she went up to see her husband before going down to watch the parade down at the curb, and she arrived around noon. And this document, this FBI interview, you can find on Commission Document 897, page 36. When she arrived down there at noontime, she went up to see him before meeting up with some of his co-workers to watch the parade down at the curb. And one of the co-workers was Mary Lee Williams. And Mary Lee also mentioned John in an interview that she did, which is part of Commission Exhibit 1381. That was a bundle, which included some 79 interviews with all the employees of the TSBD. But anyway, this John Hawkins is not mentioned in any witness list or even as an employee in any employee roster for Allen and Bacon, and the Warren Commission published the roster of the employees of this company in the Commission document 87. If you go to that document, page 787 and 788, you will see that he's not even on there. Now, who was John Hawkins? And why, did he just disappear, into thin air after the assassination? There's absolutely no record of this man. And that's very strange, and nobody has ever, taken the initiative to find out what happened and why, after, they scrutinized everybody that was there, during the assassination, everybody that worked there. But John Hawkins was never, ever looked for. They never interviewed him, no FBI, Dallas police, nobody whatsoever. That's very interesting, that angle there on Brunson, with the firecrackers and the streamers. And why would they do something like that? From there, she talked about it. She wrote about silenced shots and silenced weapons. Now, back in 1968, not very many people were talking about that. That would be the reason why you would want to use firecrackers and streamers to attract attention away from the actual weapons that were going to be used, which would have been silenced weapons. By carefully studying the Zapruder film frame by frame, Brunson was able to determine that shots could be detected at frames 227 and 234. And these are frames where she visibly noticed that Kennedy and Connolly had been struck with different bullets. Combined with the information that Weisberg had discovered where there was a shot fired at frame 210, she was able to ascertain that the silenced weapons were the only means of achieving this. So the only problem with the ear witnesses, people who heard shots, she wrote, was that most of them heard one shot followed by a long interruption and then that double shot at the end. So, and in between, she detected the reactions of Kennedy and Connolly that were out of sync with those reported gunshots. That would have been the reason why those firecrackers and streamers were so important in this operation. This is all research done by Beverly Brunson. Now is when we're able to bring it out, and talk about it and research it.
Right, we're talking about 1968. 1968, right. This woman is bringing all this stuff out.
It makes her such an amazing researcher, and in only 2 years that she was researching JFK, because later on, something happened that we might have time to talk about very briefly here. One thing that she also talked about was how rifles were used in everything that was written about the assassinations, specifically how they were trying to set up the use of rifles, for example, in the rifle range, rifles being unloaded on the day, for example, Julia Mercer,
Jack Ruby unloading some men.
Right. Rifle being brought in supposedly by Lee Oswald, under his arm, supposedly witnessed by Bill Wesley Frazier. So much attention drawn to rifles when in reality that it could have been that some other weapon was used during the assassination, maybe something at a closer range, which maybe, and this is speculation on my part, could have been from the storm drain at much closer range than what we've been led to believe. All this is coming from Beverly's research. So
let's talk about the storm drain for 1 second. It's been alleged that the storm drain does not allow your visibility to the limousine, and you're telling me that the storm drains are not the same size. Am I correct about that?
That's right. The way they are now are not the way they were back in 1963. It was much wider. And over time, the level of the pavement there has risen, and it's much narrower now than what it used to be. Jack Brazil did a lot of research on that. It's been proven that at that time it was much wider.
I see.
I wanted to quote something real quick here that she wrote. Please understand that the important thing is not where I think the silencer may have been located, but that the evidence that a silencer was located somewhere is, in my opinion, almost proven. If you reread the evidence, what the witnesses said, especially those in the president's car and the follow-up car, keeping in view that a silencer may have been used, you will have a revelation. There could have been 2 silencers, of course. There were many more seen shots on the street, smoke in the trees, scarring on the sidewalk, hitting the turf, hitting the manhole, than there were heard shots. And I think that pretty much sums it up there,
She's exactly
that were
right.
seen versus what was heard. And even Weisberg agreed with her, saying that her theory on the silences was very intriguing and that he had never himself thought of it. Yeah, just to talk a little bit about the options, she definitely thought it was Lee Oswald there. She documented a lot of the alterations that we're talking about now. The one that had never been actually looked at was what we just talked about, the streamer on the hood of LBJ's car. Very interesting what she had to say about Lovelady, that Lovelady wanted out. You didn't want to be the person to be doorman. That's why he went to the FBI in his vertical striped shirt on February 29, 1964. And that's a very interesting theory that she had, and it might have been right on the money. Might have been right there. She wrote about him leaving himself that opening to let it be proven that wasn't him. This was her, back in 1968. Beverly Brunson. Let me just briefly talk about frame 240. The Zapruder frame 240. If you look at Jackie's collar of her outfit, you'll see that the blue collar there has been extended over her right shoulder, much further out than the left shoulder. Brunson also wanted to know, why that was so, because, women, they look at fashion right away, and she sort of hooked up on that one right away. And if you look at the Zapruder frame 240, you'll notice that. But what happened to her later in 1968, she went out for a meeting. Apparently she was so into JFK research and going back and forth with Weisberg, and so many different papers and documents that she sent Weisberg in her investigation, going into so many different areas. She noticed and she suspected that her mail was being opened, and she wrote Weisberg about this and asked him, is your mail being opened? Because apparently she detected that her mail was being opened. On September the 5th, 1963, she made a short drive, the 8-mile drive to Joplin, neighboring Joplin in Missouri, next to Baxter Springs. It's only maybe a 45-minute drive. This woman lured her into a meeting there, and what happened from there, it's like something really, really serious as far as what she experienced that night. Apparently they drugged her and they kidnapped her. This woman took her car and she drove her around town, and they crashed her car. Police pulled them over. At this point, she was in a passenger seat and she couldn't move, and she couldn't react to what the policemen were trying to say to her. And they assumed that she was just stone drunk. Later on, as she was driving her car, she was pulled over by 5 cops who had been chasing her for the past hour and a half, and that she had been driving on the wrong side of the road with the headlights off, speeding and running red lights, causing minor accidents. And the last thing that she remembers, that she had blacked out. So the next morning, they sent her to the hospital that same night, and she had a knot on her forehead, and she had cuts on her legs. And the attending physician there verified that she wasn't drunk. And this incident was reported in newspapers at the time in Joplin and Baxter Springs. And she reported this to Weisberg, and Weisberg was very, very concerned. And he thought that if anybody would have experienced something like that, it would have been Weisberg himself. But in my mind, I think that this was a clear warning to Beverly and to Weisberg to lay off, some of these very, very sensitive areas of investigation that they were working on. Like the motorcycle cops that we talked about earlier, the Algins 6 versus the Zapruder 255,
just so many things
in the streamer.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, we just like to keep on going.
The issue of the downhill slope on Elm Street, and all these areas that nobody else was really looking into on the assassination.
It appears to me that the entire JFK community, minus a few people, and the Warren Commission type people have spent the last 50 years to keep everything that Beverly was trying to tell us.
Gary, and what happened that after this incident in 1968, she became a recluse, and she totally disappeared and stopped investigating JFK. And it's very, very sad, that something like this happened to her. And who knows? Who knows what they told her, happened, in the background, that made her, quit all of her JFK investigations. And like I said earlier, most of her papers, all of her papers and her work on JFK totally disappeared in that accident. And the only surviving documents are the ones that are at the Weisberg site.
Mm-hmm. Well, sounds like there's a gold mine, Larry, and it seems like you're digging it right in there. All right, Larry, thank you so much for being on The Real Deal.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you very much.